encourage your questions. Please go ahead and type those in, and I'll get to as many as I can. So without further ado, this is me. If you don't know me, or I didn't meet you at ILTA earlier this year where I was part of a panel on this same topic. Some of you may have seen that it was an auto-classification panel with a number of different parties. Based on that, I was asked to please come and provide this masterclass. So that's who I am on the left. You can check out my LinkedIn profile. I think each one of you is going to get a copy of this presentation, so that will be a live link. You can go check me out. Feel free. I'm going to be your essentially Sherpa / professor today, talking about auto-classification, particularly in a legal context, so for information governance, veering a little bit into e-discovery and records. And because this is ILTA, I'm going to try and carry along a perspective of both a law firm and a law firm client, let's say a large corporation. So I'm going to try and give you the dual view on everything we cover. Okay, we have a lot of objectives that we want to cover today. Today's presentation is essentially adapted down. It's kind of distilled from a much larger presentation that I've given in the past. If you want to hear the full shebang, I encourage you to look on Valora's YouTube channel, where there's a 5-part webinar series on all of the topics. Today you're going to get the highlights of that. So we're going to be talking about structured data versus unstructured data, and how to identify good candidates for auto-classification, what auto-classification really is, and how to use it to drive many different elements of information governance, such as legal hold, compliance, privacy protections, data migrations, and many other things essentially around the analysis, control, and movement of enterprise data. We're going to help you build a game plan. So if you do have a project in your immediate future, or you're already underway, you will have a kind of working checklist to use so that you can make sure you cover all your bases and don't get caught by any surprise gotchas. We're going to help you demonstrate a provable ROI. This is becoming more and more of a key point because most organizations are becoming comfortable with the notion that they need to modernize their practices. And so an ROI is a great way to get buy-in across other groups in the organization that may not directly benefit from modernizing your information management. So we'll talk about how to do that. And then finally, hopefully you will walk away from this session armed with the ability to speak confidently and to really analyze your organization's maturity in the whole information governance arena. Where are you on the spectrum from newbie to expert, and what are the steps you can take to move further along to the expert status? All right, let's dive in. If anyone feels they do not live in a sea of information, that is fantastic, good for you. Nearly everyone that I talk to all around the world feels that they are drowning in a sea of information, and that's because as a society, we have basically learned to keep everything. We've done a little bit better on paper. We try to distill down to the most critical paper, and then we send it off to an Iron Mountain or whatever, and it's out of sight, out of mind. We've done a much poorer job with electronic information, where it's easy to keep everything. It's relatively low cost, at least on a file-by-file basis to do so, and we feel like we are safe in saving everything. There are a lot of costs, though, to that practice, and we're just beginning to see a bunch of them now. So for sanity, a typical large enterprise, let's say your typical corporation, is going to have at least 6 data storage silos. So silo is the word for location of data, where data is hiding out. So these are the common ones that we see everywhere. Everybody's got an email server, and it is jam-packed with stuff. A shared file server is like your R drive or your L drive, or if you have an archive drive. There's everybody's kind of loose arena, things like if you have a My Docs folder, or you're just using desktop, if you have removable hard drives. don't even get me started on the mobile and social media that we're all hoarding. And then, of course, everybody's favorite, we pretend we're not using it, but of course everybody is cloud storage and cloud collaborative data. So this is the minimum that nearly every organization will have. There's usually a litany that accompanies this for any single organization, but as a kind of common denominator, nearly all organizations will face at least these 6. So the downside of having that, and I've quoted a lot of different industry reports and tried to give credit so that you could go and look at them if you like. Some of them are a little dated. The statistics are still valid. They're only more so. But basically, today, we spend so much time searching for information or recreating information that as workers, we're not very productive. And that, of course, has a cost to it. What's not listed here are some other costs that are really starting to move to the forefront, such as the cost of a breach, because we saved everything and we didn't lock it down, or we're not sure what we have or where it lives. That's very similar to the cost of a litigation matter. Having to identify all instances of X and where it might live, that is very similar to data privacy. If we are subject to GDPR, let's say, how do we know what data we have, where it lives, and how are we going to respond to a subject access request within 30 days? So these are some of the kind of conditional elements that are driving the need to get control of the data already. We have pretty much kept our head in the sand as far as electronic data, sort of waiting for future generations to figure out a solution and manage it. Well, that time has come. We're sort of out of time. And so fortunately, there are technologies and approaches that can help us. As I like to say, and some of you have maybe heard me say this, technology got us into this mess, and technology is going to get us out of it. So auto-classification, I'm going to go into a much greater definition in a moment, but briefly, it is software or technology that is aware of enterprise content. By the way, enterprise can mean a corporation, can mean a law firm, can mean a government agency. It just means some sort of organization, okay? So auto-classification is aware of what enterprise data is out there, what it is, and how it should be treated. I'm going to leave it there for the moment, and we'll come back to it. But if you think about that technology as a kind of traffic cop directing the action in an organization, a lot of this will start to make sense. So this is what a typical law firm would look like. You're going to have, at a minimum, these 4 data silos. You're going to have file shares for just, kind of working material. You're going to have kind of group work areas, maybe SharePoint, maybe a case matter folder. You'll almost certainly have some sort of database, like you might be using iManage or NetDocs as repositories for information. Surely you're using email. And you may or may not, and officially or unofficially, be using some cloud applications as well. This is what we tend to see for law firms. You're lucky there's only 4 up here. Remember I said earlier, a typical corporation has 6. So this is what we see as data silos. This is where the data lives. Then we have the applications, the uses that are asking for data. So search and retrieval, retention and legal hold, maybe some kind of privacy analysis. Maybe it's time to migrate on up to the cloud, or maybe it's just good kind of healthy data hygiene. So these are use cases that really need to look across each of these data silos and perform some kind of action with an awareness and a knowledge of the content in all of them. So something has to be in the center serving as traffic cop, and that's where auto-classification comes in. It's basically aware of all the information in here, not just that it exists, but what it is and who should have access and when. So you can think about that as a combination of what is this? So a traffic cop knows what is this, and what do I do with it? And you can think of those loosely as analysis and disposition. We're going to come back to those in a little while. All right. Let's take a slight detour to talk about content in general. You guys have probably heard these terms, and no auto-classification masterclass would be complete without covering them, so here we go. You've heard of structured content, and you've heard of unstructured content. Structured content is very simply content that looks and feels like a database. It lives in some sort of structured, that's why it's called that, format, like an ERP or an Excel spreadsheet is a great example of structured content. Anything that has essentially like this, and this is yanked straight off of Barnes & Noble, anything that has a field name, like the name of the field is price, and the field value happens to be £7.99, that's the field value. Anything that's sort of presented or lives like this, like a record in a database, that is structured content. And it's generally fairly easy to query, to either query the database or maybe there's an application in front with a little search bar on it. It's relatively easy to get at the content of this file as well as the metadata. This is all metadata about the file. So structured content is easy, helpful, and a small fraction of the content, particularly in an enterprise context, that's available out there. So structured content isn't really a problem usually. It's just kind of also there. If you want a formal definition, this is from TechTarget. I thought it was an excellent definition. So I'll let you guys take a look at the official definition of structured content. Okay, got it. What is unstructured content? So unstructured content is basically everything else. So it's all of that stuff that we deal with as modern day workers every single day, email and attachments, text, or if you're using a link or one of those, anything that you would produce in Word or not Excel, PowerPoint, or some kind of, graphics package. Even things like videos or voicemail are going to be considered unstructured content. And here's how you know. If the content could just as easily be 1 line long as 100 lines long, and it just kind of depends on the document du jour or the topic at hand, then that's unstructured content. So email's a great example of that. Your email could be 1 sentence long, see you later, or your email could be, like I sometimes get, 6 pages of content. That's the hallmark of unstructured content, is an unknown length, unknown topics and substance. An email may have attachments or may not. It could have 1 attachment. It could have 20 attachments. It could have a link. And so you get the sense of what unstructured content really is. It is, by and large, the majority of material that we each work with every day. Certainly at a law firm, the bulk of what you do is unstructured. And so unstructured content is kind of the thorn in everybody's side right now. It doesn't have a database structure. It doesn't have fielded content or metadata about it. And that's what auto-classification looks to fix. Here's the official definition, a little longer, from TechTarget. It's basically what we just said. It's pretty much everything else. So now that we know what unstructured content is, we know it's the bulk of the information being stored in most organizations. Typically about 80% or more is unstructured. It is the massive growth area, by the way. Think about it. Every time we email or text or whatever, going back and forth, we're making more of it. Much less frequently are we making database records. So enter auto-classification, whose primary goal is to make unstructured data structured. So that's, in a nutshell, what auto-classification is and does. It's software that can look at unstructured text and create structure from it. So you need text. That is definitely a starting point here. And we'll talk about what happens for things that don't have native text, like, let's say, a scanned image. It had text on paper. Now it's an image, or it's a recording of a webinar like this. So we'll talk about them in a minute. But one way or another, you have text. Next, you need to generate metadata. And the richer your metadata, the stronger your auto-classification. That should make sense. Together, these two create context around content. So just so nobody gets confused, because those words differ by only one letter, we're going to take a tiny little foray into what exactly is context. All right. If you've seen me present before, don't say anything, because some people haven't. So this is the easiest way that I have found for people to understand what do we mean about context around enterprise content. So I wonder if anyone would mind. So here's a cute little cartoon. It's a cute little doggy. I wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap. Aw, that's so sweet. And it's adorable because it's a little doggy thinking it, and it's obviously somebody's home, and that just sounds lovely and sweet. Now, let's take the exact same phrase and have one of your workers saying this. Not so cool. Is this guy billing me? Is this guy responsible for some kind of deadline? Is he on the clock? Not okay. Let's try another context. Anybody take a flight recently? What would you say if you heard that come over the loudspeaker? That would definitely not be okay. And so the context, this might even be the same guy. It kind of looks like the same guy. This is him in the office. What about if he's in midair? And then you have kind of the sad one. What if you had what appears to be a hobo coming into your office and saying, wonder if anyone would mind if I curled up under this desk and took a nap? So each of these is the exact same phrase. And if you were just doing a simple search, all of them would come back. You would have 4 hits. Okay? The context is what's different. So context is who is speaking, or to whom is the content addressed. So you can think about the who aspect. The time of day, or the venue in which that is being presented. It might be something like, what language is it in? Or what was the original purpose of that content? And so you can see there's nuance to be added that context adds that is beyond just the pure play text. So that's why it's called context. It's adding depth to the text and insight that will be particularly valuable if you are attempting to make a disposition on some sort of file. Like, do I need to keep this? Well, it might depend who said it. So that's context. We're done with our little foray into context now that everybody understands. So now we can return to auto-classification. So auto-classification is really a marriage of 2 concepts. This notion of rich metadata. So I'm not just talking the file metadata that you might sometimes see, last modified date, file type .xlsx or .pdf. That's metadata, but it's not rich metadata. Rich metadata, we'll show you in a minute, is quite rich and thick in terms of discussing. Metadata is data about data, so in discussing what that content contains. That's this part of the equation. The second is rules. And so rules are essentially, and we're going to go into this, but are a sort of a language, a structure. Remember, we're making the unstructured structured. So adding structure to a document about disposition or handling. So what should I do with a document if or when certain conditions are met? That's what the rules are. And I'm going to show you the interplay between the 2 of them. Just so everybody's clear, we're not talking about manually doing this. That would just be classification or manual classification. The auto in this word is software doing this work on behalf of people. It's a little bit different. Some of you are probably familiar with predictive coding if you have an e-discovery background. It's a little bit different than predictive coding. Predictive coding is essentially an elaborate mimicry technique where some sort of expert sits down and codes a bunch of documents and then says to the software, essentially, follow my lead. Auto-classification is a little bit different. It's more of a rules-based structure. So it's kind of like a thou shalt do X. And rules are generated, and then the software follows the rules as opposed to following the action. So there's a subtlety there. But it is definitely software doing the work. It also lends itself well to machine learning. If you're familiar with AI and machine learning, I am essentially describing a machine learning process. So there are recognition algorithms that are going to recognize different types of documents. And just so everybody's on the same page, the difference between a file type, a document type, and a record type. So a file type is what I said earlier, PDF, XLSX, .msg. Those are file types. A document type is something like cash flow statement, sales forecast, motion to compel, okay, a document type. And then a record type, if there are folks that are involved in information governance or records on the call, those are things that will get a further designation that says, whatever your doc type, this needs to be kept either permanently or for a specific period of time. So let's say, here, we'll take it all the way through. Let's say your file type is PDF, your document type is contract, and your record type is keep for 7 years, or contract 7, something like, it's usually what they're called, contract plus 7. So that's the distinguishing between different genres. And so the software has algorithms for recognizing, obviously, all of those types, as well as many other attributes. We'll talk about that in a second. And it's sometimes described as middleware. Remember the traffic cop, the little Lego head in the beginning? That is essentially an auto-classification platform, sits in the middle and is considered middleware, that's the term, in between where the files live and how they are used. So this is an important point. Auto-classification is not an ECM, the files, or a hosted repository. The files don't go into auto-classification and stay there. Auto-classification instead typically sort of passes over them, knows where they are, and leaves them alone, and is still analyzing them in the background. So it's independent of the file storage. That's very important because on the one hand, it means you can cut across all those different silos. And on the other hand, it means it can move stuff around from one to the other because it doesn't depend on them being physically present inside the auto-classification platform. So it's independent. Same thing is true on the application layer. You can have essentially infinite applications calling up to the auto-classification saying, hi, I'm looking for everything that meets XYZ criteria, and the auto-classification layer will dictate back, here's where it all lives, and by the way, what you can have based on your login. Now we're getting real fancy, but based on your security of the application ask, here's what you're permitted back to see. All right, we got a little bit deeper there. All right, so we're going to go into some detail now around what we mean by rich metadata and rules. Okay, so these are all examples of rich metadata. Folks from the e-discovery world will recognize themselves in the red balloon. You've seen that kind of metadata before, but you probably have not seen such detail, the other color balloons. If you look at just the blue balloon, for example, these are all just variations on the theme of date. A document, a file can have many, many types of date. Usually there's kind of a hierarchy as to which date kind of trumps the others in terms of I am the most important date, but there's no reason not to collect them all. They might be equally valuable. So all of these are gettable using an auto-classification engine. So in kind of today's ethical content management world, there's really no excuse not to know, first of all, where your data is, but secondly, what it contains. There's software that will, kind of run over that at night and show you in the morning exactly what you have. And so you'll notice PII is an option. Auto classification can tell you whether or not there's a social security number present or any other variant of PII, whether or not a document or its contents are likely to be subject to GDPR, whether they might meet a discovery request or a subject access request. All of these are very easy to answer simply by editing the auto classification rules that you're running that minute. So that brings up another thing, which is that auto classification is a kind of always on, evergreen type of technology. You can use it once, again, kind of a little more like an e-discovery model, kind of use it once and step away, but really the benefit is to have it keep running in the background and staying current. You might be analyzing things like the retention of content, right? We need to keep this for 6 years. So you want it to kind of periodically assess throughout that 6-year time frame, how close am I to the end and have I passed it? It might be time to get rid of that document. And so that's just an example of why you might want to keep things running over time, because a robust auto classification system is aware of time and its passage. So these are all examples of rich metadata that's relatively easy for an auto classification engine to gather. Pretty much anything you can think of as a data field. Remember that little picture that had the ebook available? It had price, it had, I think, ISBN number. All of those would count as variations of rich metadata. Other types of rich metadata not listed on here: zip code, chemical name, street address, middle initial, you name it. Over here at Valora, I can tell you we've supported upwards of about 600 different fields of metadata. So if you're evaluating auto classification, you're thinking about its use case in your environment, ask yourself, what would it be really helpful to know about this content? If you're in a law firm, would it be helpful to know matter number, case number, jurisdiction, witness name? I bet it would be. If you're in a corporate environment, would it be useful to have things like business unit, custodian, product name, office location, things like that? All of those, very easy. Just think of them as attributes that are easy to get. One more, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. There's a whole bunch of hidden metadata also available. Sometimes you've seen it if you've ever unlocked all the hidden fields in Excel. There are also kinds of hidden fields now, like behind pictures, GIFs and things like that. If you're taking a picture with your phone, there's hidden metadata that indicates your location at the time of that picture. So using latitude, longitude triangulation, we can figure out what that's a picture of. In case you're wondering how Google does that, that's how they do it. So that's probably more than you ever wanted to know about rich metadata. Here's the other half of that equation: rules. So rules are quite simply algorithms, and don't be put off by that word. Some algorithms are very, very easy, that determine the disposition of content. So the first step was metadata. Tell me what this is in great detail. And then the second half of the equation is rules. Now tell me what to do with it. So that's what rules do. So this is a very simple kind of baby step type of rule. It's a retention rule. And you can see they tend to follow an if-then structure. So if, remember document type, if the document type is a contract and let's say the effective date is below this point, then mark it as active or retain it. So there you go. Boom, you've written a retention rule. You see one on screen. You can now apply this retention rule across your data. Now, you have to have known the document type. That was the first half. Doing that metadata, that rich metadata is going to tell you document type. It's going to tell you date. Not from the file metadata, but from the actual textual content of the file. That's what auto classification does. It goes into the file, essentially reads, and I'm making air quotes with that, reads the content, and then pulls out this attribute information, stores it away so that the rules can make use of it. I'm going to show you the whole picture in 1 second. So this is, we've all got it. Okay, I got it. If, then, rule, yeah. So once you have this kind of structure, you can use rules to analyze and, if this were a word, disposit all kinds of different needs. So retention, okay, we got it. You can also figure out security level. Does this file contain sensitive PII in it? Oh, it does? It should probably be locked down or maybe moved to a safer location, not just floating out there on the R drive for everybody to get at. It might be how you decide what file should migrate to the new server, to the cloud, to a client folder. All of these are actions that you can take. For example, maybe we should get rid of junk. Oh, it's a spam email. Perhaps we could delete it. Those, anytime you take an action, you're in the disposition rule kind of universe. And now you know what rules look like, and they can kind of nest and be hierarchical and dependent and statistically this versus that. You can kind of go nuts, or you can keep it really simple. Obviously, that depends on your use case. So now we understand what rules are. Remember, metadata plus rules. All right. Here's the whole picture. So here's the whole thing from soup to nuts. So the first thing that happens is essentially a processing step. If you're familiar with e-discovery processing, it's very similar. Basically, we are trying to get to the text. If it's a native file, we're going to do exactly what they do in e-discovery. We're going to pull out the text from that PDF, or that, more likely, that Word file. Okay, if it's not a native file, native electronic file, let's say it's a scanned image, then we're going to run OCR. OCR, optical character recognition, an old technology that is used to take an image to have a textual rendition. So one way or another, we're going to get to text. And by the way, for those of you in the fancy camp here who already know half of this, yeah, it works on audio and video too. So in that case, we're going to use speech to text and use something like IBM Watson or something like that to take the speech wave file, turn it into text. It's a lot like OCR. And once again, get a textual rendition. This also applies to multiple language. So sometimes you might want to process in the language, like keep everything in French and run in French. Or sometimes you want to translate over into English and then run everything. Again, depends on your use case. But all of that is part of this get to text step. This is ultimately textual analysis at the end of the day. So, okay, get to text, step one. Step two, do that tagging step, that rich metadata. Give me that running litany of every attribute you can think of that might be useful here. Again, this is is it 10 fields, 20 fields, 100 fields? Probably not 100, but you could. And get that kind of field data. Essentially what's being made here is a database record. Think of it as almost a meta record about the content. So there's the file, and then there's the file about the file, or the record about the file. And then finally, that disposition step, the applying rules that say, so processing means get me to text. Tagging means tell me what it is. And then disposition is tell me what to do with it. Where am I going to put it? How am I going to treat it? When am I going to deal with it? Okay. So now let's take a look at the whole picture. Sorry, I'm choking over here. Okay. So here's a pretty good law firm example. So a law firm partner is instructing, let's say, a legal assistant to go ahead and file the motion. So what the auto-classification objective here is to essentially determine matter number and be able to identify that a matter number is present and then move the content to the correct matter number. Of course, this is a very easy one. It's given both in English and in the matter number digits, which is terrific. That's not always the case, but we've indicated it here just so you would get an idea. So here's what the auto-classification engine is doing. First, it's collecting any given metadata. Emails do have some given metadata, which is nice, like author, recipient, things like that. Then it's going to start in with the body text. So in here, we have a signature block that might tell us that S. Trumbull is in fact Stuart Trumbull. We now have an affiliated organization for Stuart. We have a title, a cell phone. All of this is now positively identified with Stuart. So that in the event let's just say we just see this cell phone number somewhere else, in some other data repository, maybe he sent a text from his phone and that was the number, we now know who that is and can correlate that back to Stuart Trumbull. Okay, so that's what we mean by validation. Here, we're identifying both the words of the matter and the matter number, almost certainly querying that against a matter database. Almost every law firm today has either a matter database or at the very least a file that lists your matters, and going against that and validating, going, yep, that's legit. Don't forget about the attachment and what else might be in there. We've got a little clue that it's maybe emotion. Obviously, we go into the attachment as well and determine that, but this is just a little bit of a confidence booster because it's in the body text too. So the software goes through and essentially does this kind of collection. Sometimes I call this kind of like gene sequencing the document, or kind of like a blood test. Your doctor takes a blood test. They know every single thing there is about you. Same thing here. We took a tiny little kind of blood test of this, and now we know everything about it. And so the red in this picture is essentially, this is the metadata kind of collection part. And then the blue is the disposition, the rule that says, okay, we are well over the confidence bar to calling this Passaro, and therefore go ahead and file it there. In other words, get it out of the email system and put it into the content management system in this location. Okay? All right, let's look at another example. So now we're going to find junk, what we might call in some context defensible deletion, or if you're familiar with the term rot for redundant, obsolete, or trivial, basically junk. So here you go. Merry Christmas 2014. It is the ultimate rot. And this is floating around everybody's systems. Don't feel bad if it's floating around yours. It's everywhere. Typical organization has about 30% rot floating around. And while you think that maybe there's no cost to that, there is. There's a storage cost to that. There's a processing cost to that. That's what gets in the way of us being able to do productive searches and analysis, is that we have all this junk in our way. It's like wading through junk piles to get to something. And so here's how the software, AutoClassification, can determine that this is junk. It's got terms on the watch list like Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, or other likely ones, it's a boy, it's a girl, Mazel Tov. These are all on the watch list. It's got a date that is rapidly becoming, very quickly becoming 4 years ago. There's no further content, so what I would call kind of the signal to noise ratio, very, very poor here. There's 4,000 identical copies in the organization. Do we really need those? Okay, we could either remove all, or if you really want to be careful, remove 3,999 of them and keep one. Or if you want to be a little more careful, keep one and keep a pointer in the other 3,999 locations, but you don't have to keep all 4,000. Okay, when you think about that playing out in an organization, 30–40% rot across hundreds, millions of terabytes, pretty soon you're talking significant money. All right, one last one. What about a contract? Works the same way. This would work for a contract, a claim, a motion, anything that's got kind of rich and thick content in it. Go ahead and find the clauses. Okay, so this is AutoClassification first, doing that metadata piece, pulling out all the relevant info, and then potentially taking an action. Oh, this needs to be retained, it's a contract, or this needs to, send out an alert, or whatever it is that needs to happen once this work is done. In some cases, this is all that needs to be done. There is no action to take. What you needed was just the info. That's fine. In that case, your metadata is the most important part, and your rules is basically 0. All right. So now that you kind of understand how it works and you understand the two sides of auto classification, you can see all these different use cases will start to kind of suggest themselves. And of course, if you're involved in anything with Europe, then you know about GDPR, which is a bonus 11th. So let's move on. All right. Now we're getting into the advanced part. So to unlock the real power, everything you've seen so far, I mean, it's pretty good, but now you can get really fancy, which is in essentially taking control of all that unstructured data and saying, all right, I want you to start taking actions. I want you to move stuff. I want you to label it. I want you to send out alerts, so on and so forth. So the first thing that we recommend to clients when we're working with them is to understand kind of what's your mission. And you may have more than one. Again, a sophisticated auto classification platform should be able to support multiple missions at a time. We would call that configurations, multiple configurations on the same base processing chassis. And so the easiest way for people to understand is, are you looking to do search and rescue, or are you looking to do seek and destroy? So search and rescue would be something like, we're trying to get all the files into the right matter number folder because they're all over the place, or they've never been classified at all. You know, like we want to get our emails into these folders. That would be a search and rescue. A seek and destroy would be something, let's take a corporate example. We have a retention policy over here on the left hand, and we have huge file shares that nobody is managing over here on the right hand. We need our file shares to comply with our retention policy, and we need to get rid of rot and things that we're not supposed to be retaining anymore. That would be more of a seek and destroy mission, just to give you a feel for different types. Basically, you want to kind of figure out what's your goal, gather up information. In other words, you know, what are you trying to accomplish? And this is important. Try to understand where your information lives. Is it in a hard drive? Is it on a file share? Is there any metadata? Yes or no? Has anybody attempted to classify this before? Any of that will be useful in essentially scoping your solution. We have a more detailed checklist, so I'm going to kind of skip some of this. All right. It might be helpful. Again, this is a master class, so let's go. There are 3 kinds of rules that you should know about. And they kind of go from easy to hard back to easy again. So bucket rules, and these are Valora terms, but bucket rules are essentially simplistic rules that are based on kind of objective categories like geography. You know, anything that's domestic, go over here. Anything international, go over there. Or it might be something simple like custodian. You know, everything is broken down by custodian. So those are very simple taxonomic structures. A taxonomy is basically a folder structure, if you're not familiar with that word. It's basically, how do you store your content and what are the rules for foldering? So you can have very simple, what we call bucket rules, just simple categories. Or you can go hog wild and have, 97 layers deep and a very, very strict taxonomy, and every single field and node and split is laid out on a wall map. That's what we call end node rules. You can do that, and auto classification will support that. It's a lot of work. And we generally recommend you kind of pare that down if you can. And then over into data-driven rules. Data-driven rules, this is now the machine learning part, are essentially rules that create and manage themselves. So let's say you were looking for something like matter name, typical effort for a law firm, matter name or attorney name. So that would derive from either your conflicts database or your ERP or some sort of listing that you have. Where do you track your matters? Where do you track your staff? So an auto classification engine is a modern day piece of software. It can integrate with those other data sources, what we call guidance data. So it's not data you're not analyzing the attorney name, you're just using that as an input, guidance data. And so you hook the two systems together, and then the rule for determining matter name or attorney name auto-generates from the query of the ERP system. And so if somebody leaves the firm or joins the firm, of course their name goes into the ERP system. Auto classification is keeping current, so it regenerates its rules basically within seconds of that event happening. So we're getting kind of sophisticated here, but it's important because you need your auto classification to stay current if you're going to have it be evergreen and moving forward in time. It has to know that, Joe Bob attorney left the firm yesterday. And so it has to stay current with its guidance data. And so these are the most sophisticated kinds of rules and the ones obviously that we recommend people use. All right, so here's an example of data-driven rules. So here is, for Stark Industries, yes, we made that up, a retention and destruction policy. Some of them are a little richer and thicker than this, but by and large, this is what a typical retention or destruction policy looks like. In other words, what kind of document, there's document type, and how long do I have to keep it? Some of them are permanently, okay? And so remember that metadata and rules? So the metadata is going to tell me what it is, and then the rules are going to tell me what to do with it. So here's an example of what rules look like. And at first blush, they're like, oh my God, that looks awful. And then when you look a little closer, you realize it's not really that bad. It's using a field value, see doc type, that's that metadata field, and then making certain dispositions. So here's, this should be deleted, this should be quarantined, this should never expire, and so on. So this is literally a screenshot out of Valora's rules engine, so that you can kind of see what you're aiming for and what the software is kind of setting up to execute on your behalf. So this is kind of really deep into the rules on auto classification. All right, so let's get into the sample project. If you're going to be using this kind of technology or working with a provider, working with a consultant, you're going to need to answer a bunch of questions. So here they come. To the extent you can get this information before the fact, the better off you will be. This first one seems kind of silly. What are we trying to accomplish? But you'd be amazed how often people aren't really sure what they're trying to accomplish. So what we first the easiest thing for you to figure out is how much data volume. So start there. What exactly do you have? Do you have, 3 terabytes or do you have 50 petabytes? Those are really, really different. And probably right next to it, data volume is timeline. Because it's one thing to go through, 20 terabytes in a day. It's another thing to go through 20 petabytes in a day. It's going to determine the scale of your processing. So it's not just how much you have, but what your timeline is to accomplish it. And while everybody would like everything done in a day, that may not be realistic for your hardware budget. So again, a smart vendor should be able to walk you through that. But it's something you could gather in advance of what is your ideal scenario. This is another critically important question. What quality is needed? And the reason I say that is because this is an automated system. It's using software to the best of its ability. It will not be 100% perfect. Let me be clear about that. That said, it's pretty good. The accuracy is going to range probably between 85% and 99%, and it will depend on what you're trying to do and how complex your needs are. That being said, don't be put off by 85%. Probably what you have now is a lot worse if you're doing it manually or you're not doing it at all. You're probably down at like 10% accuracy. So don't panic by the numbers that I'm tossing out. I'm trying to be honest with you. If somebody tells you they get it right 100% of the time, walk away from that party. They're lying. Okay. There will be edge conditions. There will be circumstances, and the best you can do is try to kind of think about them in advance or deal with them when you encounter them. Obviously, budget and things like that, that goes for any project. But this is a nice little checklist that you can take with you when you're starting to think about auto classification to say, what do I need to know kind of before I call up Valora or anybody else and say, all right, I'm ready to have a conversation. See if you can answer, most of these questions. Just to give you a taste, this is what a typical project looks like here at Valora. Here's what's involved. You have to kind of follow along this way. But basically, this is not just here's your software, have a nice day. It is an iterative process. There are definitely configuration and setup and testing kind of steps. You'll see there's at least we run what we call a sandbox environment, which is a totally kind of test scenario first before we port over to the live environment. So this is what you're in for. This is not, a quickie thing. We're not going to be done in 3 days. Typically, software is being licensed on an annual basis, so there's going to be some setup time, and this is what it looks like. So obviously, we could spend all day talking about this one slide, but you guys should get a feel for what's involved in a typical project. And so now we're just going to talk through an actual project so you can get a feel for what was involved. And we'll call it an M&A inheritance project. So large organization was involved, is sort of perpetually involved in mergers and acquisitions. And in one of those acquisitions, they acquired a 200 terabyte drive of data and none of the staff that went with it. And so nobody knew what that data was, how it should be used, and most importantly, whether any of it belonged under legal hold. So that is a perfect kind of battle cry for auto-classification, file shares of unknown contents, and to figure out what is that stuff, and does any of it need special disposition, i.e. to be put under legal hold. And so when you have a project like that, we have a lot of suggestions on how to treat it. First of all, start small. Start with a department, a custodian, some sort of singleton rule, maybe one matter that you're looking for legal hold. This particular client was looking for 70 at a time. Think about who's going to be impacted by what you're doing and make sure you have their buy-in and kind of focus in on a use case. All right, don't just boil the ocean. You'll eventually boil the ocean, but start by boiling a cup of water. All right, so, and think about things as a first pass and subsequent passes, which I've kind of called early content assessment. If you know early case assessment, you'll understand that. It's basically get the lay of the land first. So run your auto classification and figure out the easy pickings. What's rot? What's vital? Deal with those, because if it's rot, you could probably get rid of it, and if it's vital, you've got to protect it. Once you've done that, you have that kind of gooey middle. What do I do with everything else? And that's what's going to go through retention and this and that and the other, and all different kinds of handling. That's when you get into LRR, or lather, rinse, repeat, those subsequent passes on the data. Well, what if we look at it through this lens or that lens, or what if we do kind of a tighter bound of XYZ? This is that iterative part. So if this is how you think about it, you realize this is not a one and done. It is a sort of iterative and essentially perpetual kind of data analysis, just like any kind of good hygiene, whether personal or data hygiene, is going to involve. So, okay, you need auto classification, right? Here's how to convince your organization. All right. Obviously, find a champion. You know that part. But choose a use case, and this is my best advice to you guys, that has a lot of impact but is not catastrophic. Because if it's catastrophic, no one will let you touch it. But if it has impact, usually there's enough pain that you can get involved and do something with that. Make sure whatever it is can scale so that you do a little pilot and then you can scale out. Start with a pilot. That's our number one recommendation. Find something small that you can get everybody's feet wet, including your vendor, and everybody be a success, and then you can roll out from there. And importantly, let the data tell you what to do. In most cases, clients aren't really sure what exactly they have, so let the data tell you. Here's an example. Oh, surprise, there's data in a foreign language. Oh, surprise, there's data from another custodian that shouldn't be here but is. Oh, surprise, there's a data dump from 1994. Where the heck did that come from? So the data will tell you what to do and how to treat it. Then it's just a quick kind of tweak of the rules and run again. So the number one way to convince your organization that you can afford auto classification is to get rid of your rot. You will save 30 to 40% of your current storage fees, which is either going to manifest as an IT expense now, or if you're already in the process of moving to the cloud, they're going to save you 30 or 40% off your Amazon or your Azure bill. That's huge. You could afford 15 auto classifications with that kind of savings. So this becomes a no-brainer. And then finally, if you are looking to assess where is your organization regarding information governance, are you ready for auto classification, how can it help you, and so on, I would strongly recommend you answer these questions and visit the ARMA. If you're not familiar with ARMA, check them out, the IG maturity model. It will tell, it's quite a detailed matrix across a variety of topics and lets you essentially score yourself to see where you are and what you should be aiming for. If you need help, there are plenty of organizations that will be more than happy to help you, mine included. So seek assistance. You'd be surprised how much is available just out there in general, or just a conversation with someone, how far that will take you. And so we're coming now to the end. Perfect timing, 5 minutes left. If you have questions beyond the scope of this, I'll try to answer any that have accumulated so far. By all means, reach out to us here at Valora. I've got a bunch of resources for you to check out here. And again, you're going to get a copy of this presentation. So you'll be able to just click on these when you receive it. This is that 5-part auto classification series I mentioned earlier. This is a copy of my presentation that I gave at ILTA earlier this year. This is a similar one I gave at ARMA, and a link to that maturity model. So I will now take a look and see what you guys have for questions. Danielle, maybe let me know where I would see that.
So they would be in the chat bar. So far, we don't have any questions
Oh,
for you.
okay.
If you are dying to ask a question, please do. We do have 3 minutes left. You can put that into the chat bar, which is in the toolbar on your Zoom application.
Oh, I see chat. There we go.
While we wait for those to come in, thank you again for the great presentation. I greatly appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure, and same to all of you. Thank you for coming in on this afternoon to listen. I could probably talk about auto classification for hours on end, and so if you would like to too, by all means reach out to me. This is my personal email here. By all means, contact me. I'd love to hear from you.